Hey, over the last couple of videos, I've asked the question of why the Israeli attack on Iran, which we have all been expecting, has not yet happened. And well, there have been many explanations provided, and I've provided some in my previous videos as well. I, for the moment, am not able to say what the reason is, but discussions between the United States and Israel about this strike apparently continue to be underway. And there's information that a very senior US general is now in Israel, and apparently he is working with the Israelis to try to agree the nature of the strike and the targets that are going to be selected and how the strike will be conducted and what role, if any, the United States is going to have. The Israelis are telling us that they intend to carry out a strike which will be surprising, devastating, and precise, which is interesting choice of words, interesting use of words, particularly the words surprising and precise. And, well, maybe we shouldn't speculate too far as to what it means, but it may suggest that the Israelis are indeed moving away from attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities and perhaps even their oil installations. Perhaps they have some other attack in mind. And when they talk about precise strikes, I have to say, speaking entirely for myself, that I do wonder whether that perhaps points to targeting of specific Iranian officials, including the most senior officials of the Iranian government. Just saying. Anyway, we have also had reports from Israel that Prime Minister Netanyahu had delayed the trip of his defense minister, Gallant, to the United States until he'd had an opportunity to speak to President Biden. And the discussion between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu has now taken place, and the White House has provided us a readout, and I'm going to read it in full. And as I said, this is the readout provided of this call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Just to anticipate, Vice President Kamala Harris was also in the call. Anyway, this is what the readout says. President Biden spoke this morning with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. Vice President Harris joined the call. The president affirmed his ironclad commitment to Israel's security. He condemned unequivocally Iran's ballistic missile attack against Israel on October 1st. On Lebanon, the president emphasized the need for a diplomatic arrangement to safely return both Lebanese and Israeli civilians to their homes on both sides of the Blue Line. The president affirmed Israel's right to protect its citizens from Hezbollah, which has fired thousands of missiles and rockets into Israel over the past year alone, while emphasizing the need to minimize harm to civilians, in particular in the densely populated areas of Beirut. On Gaza, the leaders discussed the urgent need to renew diplomacy to release the hostages held by Hamas. The president also discussed the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the imperative to restore access to the north, including by reinvigorating the corridor from Jordan immediately. They agreed to remain in close contact over the coming days, both directly and through their national security teams. Now, I have to say straight away that I find this an absolutely chaotic readout. It seems to go from one subject to another without really linking them together. And it's not even easy, at least it's not easy for me, to decipher either what really passed over the course of this telephone of this call, or what they really talked about, or what the president was seeking to convey. So he starts by saying that he condemns unequivocally Iran's ballistic missile attack against Israel on 1st October, which was 10 days ago. He then talks about Lebanon and talks about the importance of returning civilians, both civilians in Israel, to northern Israel, to their homes there, and civilians in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, to their homes there. He doesn't say anything at all about the fighting. He then talks about Hezbollah, says that Israel has a right to protect its citizens from Hezbollah. But then previously he spoke about a diplomatic arrangement to safely return both Lebanese and Israeli civilians to their homes on both sides of the blue line. So is he talking about a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah? And if so, why doesn't he actually use that word? He then talks about the importance of minimizing harm to civilians, in particular in the densely populated area of Beirut. But we've seen that Israel has conducted major missile and bomb strikes on South Beirut. Some of these have been undertaken to assassinate Hezbollah leaders. The area is indeed densely populated, and many civilians in the process of these strikes have been killed. But is he telling the Israelis to moderate their strikes? Is he telling them to hold off from further assassination attempts of Hezbollah leaders? Or is this more boilerplate language? Well, that also isn't clear at all. Then we veer back to a discussion of the Gaza crisis. And again, he talks about the urgent need to renew diplomacy to release the hostages held by Hamas. Does he support a ceasefire in Gaza or not? His administration has worked towards achieving a ceasefire in Gaza, just as it worked towards achieving a ceasefire, or so we were told, in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. But again, as with the ceasefire in Lebanon, he isn't saying anything about a ceasefire in Gaza, at least not on this occasion. He then again talks about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. He's been talking about that, well, for the better part of a year now, and it never seems to get any better despite endlessly talking about that. He talks about reinvigorating the corridor from Jordan immediately. What does that mean? What does reinvigorating mean? Does he mean that there should be more traffic through this corridor? Does he mean that the corridor should be reopened? Is the corridor indeed closed? If so, who has closed it? Is it the Jordanians? Is it Hamas? Or is it Israel? Again, it's completely unclear. And then we're told that he and Netanyahu and their respective national security teams will remain in close touch with each other. As I said, this is one of the most chaotic and bizarre readouts I have ever read. And notice that the great elephant in the room, which nobody wants to talk about, the thing that the readout never mentions, is, will there be an Israeli strike on Iran? What is the US's position about that? Surely that was the primary topic of discussion between Netanyahu and Biden over the course of this call. And yet the readout doesn't say anything about it at all. It doesn't mention in any place, anywhere, anything about a strike. It simply tells us that the president unequivocally condemns the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Israel, and then elsewhere, but in connection with Hezbollah, not with Iran. He talks about Israel having a right to protect its citizens, but he doesn't say whether the Israelis have a similar right to protect their citizens from any real, potential, or notional threat from Iran. What does this all mean? Well, I cannot imagine that they didn't discuss a strike on Iran. And it seems to me that one way or the other, that strike on Iran is going to happen at some point over the next couple of days or weeks or perhaps even hours. It may be that over what I suspect, judging from this readout, was a difficult call, with Biden apparently changing the subject repeatedly, looking as if he didn't really want to talk about the situation with Iran. Anyway, I can't imagine that this strike won't happen, and it may be that over the course of this call, the Americans did finally give the green light on it. The fact that there is an American general in Israel at this moment in time discussing the terms of the strike does strongly suggest it. But this readout is hardly the strong statement of support for Israel ahead of a potential strike on Iran that one might have expected. And I wonder whether one of the reasons why the call appears to have been such a muddled and chaotic affair wasn't the presence of the vice president, in the sense that it's clear to me that she at least has a different interest, for the moment at least, than the president himself perhaps does, in that she is fighting what is by all accounts a difficult election in what appears to be a tight race. She almost certainly does not want a major escalation of the conflict in the Middle East ahead of that election. And I wonder whether perhaps she had intervened at various times over the course of this call to try to make that point clear, though whether, of course, anybody was listening to her or paying much attention is an entirely different matter. Anyway, there it is, a muddled and confusing readout, not the strong statement of support for Israel in this particular moment that one might have expected, and certainly not an indication that the United States, certainly not a clear statement that the United States is preparing to back Israel to the hilt in the event that there is an all-out conflict between Israel and Iran. On the contrary, the readout, though in a muddled and frankly unconvincing way, constantly talks about the need to return to diplomacy, though it doesn't give the slightest guide to how it expects that should be done. Now, we've had an article in the Financial Times which perhaps is intended to complement this readout. As I've discussed in many previous programs, it does seem as if the Financial Times is in fairly close touch with the administration, or at least with senior people in the administration, and that it does publish information which appears to come from inside the administration itself. But anyway, this is the article, and this is its headline. Biden-Netanyahu call fails to dispel doubts over US sway. Washington fears its ally will overreach and that it requires a better long-term vision for its place in the Middle East. The last words, a better long-term vision for its place in the Middle East, frankly astonish me. I find that I mean, again, I don't really understand what that means precisely. Is it intended to mean that Israel should seek some kind of peace settlement with the various states in the Middle East and perhaps with the Palestinians? Or, well, what exactly is it intended to convey? But anyway, there we are. That's the headline. We're then told, and this is from the article itself, that Joe Biden on Wednesday pressed. Notice this is the word pressed. It suggests a certain degree of pressure, something which the readout itself in no way conveys. Pressed Prime Minister Netanyahu to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Lebanon and minimize civilian casualties in Israel's strikes against Hezbollah, even though previous calls for restraint from the United States have fallen flat. Well, maybe that is what Biden said, but again, that's not what the readout tells us. It may be that he did indeed tell Netanyahu, find a diplomatic solution and minimize civilian casualties. But the readout itself is far less clear. It says, yes, we must try and get everybody back to their homes. Yes, there must be diplomatic discussions, though it doesn't make it all clear between whom, whether Hezbollah is supposed to be part of those discussions. We're also told in the readout that Israel has a right to defend itself and to protect its citizens, which doesn't appear in these words and doesn't seem to be consistent with the president pressing Netanyahu to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict and minimize civilian casualties. So, this article is telling us things that go beyond what the readout says. But it does seem as if the Financial Times, as I've said, does have access to some information from within the administration. We're told that the conversation was described as direct and productive by the White House as US officials try to limit Israel's response to last week's Iranian missile attack on the country and rein in its ground offensive in South Lebanon. So some US officials are saying, to whom precisely? To the Financial Times, to the media in general, obviously, in part at least, to the Financial Times, that the discussion between Biden and Netanyahu, though direct, which suggests that it was tense, Politico has told us that on occasions they've been shouting at each other. Though how President Biden shouts at people nowadays, I'm not clear. But anyway, the two were shouting, at times have shouted at each other, but nonetheless that the call was productive. And then again, this article tells us something which the readout doesn't say, that the United States is trying to limit Israel's response to last week's Iranian missile attack on the country. As I said, the readout doesn't talk about a potential Israeli response to that missile strike at all. And it also talks about reining in Israel's ground offensive in South Lebanon. But again, we don't have any real sign of that from the readout. So, but the article in the Financial Times definitely appearing to go beyond what the readout says. But then we're also told that there are widespread doubts over Biden's influence over Netanyahu after the Prime Minister has time and again ignored Washington's pleas for limited military operations and increased diplomatic engagement. So why assume that this time it's going to be any different? And the article then goes on to say that according to the White House, who in the White House? Who exactly? Are they again talking to the Financial Times specifically? Biden did not call for Israel to stop all military operations in Lebanon. But then, of course, the readout told us as much. There's no statement there that Israel should cease military operations. And as we know, the Israelis would certainly not be interested in anything like that. And then we're told this absolutely astonishing thing. This is in the Financial Times article as well. The White House did not say whether the two leaders discussed Israel's looming response to Iran. So the Readout tells us that they didn't discuss it, and the White House isn't saying whether they discussed it either, though that must have been, that surely was the primary purpose of the call, to discuss that very thing. Anyway, we're then told about how limited the leverage Biden has over Netanyahu, and we are then, the article in the Financial Times finishes with some comments from an international affairs analyst at the Center for a New American Security, Jonathan Lord, one of the endless numbers of think tanks that you find in Washington. Anyway, he says, or he's quoted as saying, that US policy has been trying to both deter and de-escalate at the same time. And really, realistically speaking, you can most effectively do one or the other, but trying to do both seems to have limited effects in both directions. And the article says that many in Washington say US diplomacy towards Israel has floundered. Well, there we are, a chaotic readout, an article in the Financial Times which doesn't really provide much in the way of clarity. It's still completely unclear what view the United States wants us to think it has about the strike that is coming against Iran. Now, let me repeat again, I am confident that there will be an Israeli strike against Iran, and it might not be quite as massive as some people say, though we will only know after it happens. But clearly there is going to be a strike. Why all the doubts and uncertainty? Why all the muddle and confusion? Why all the long discussions? Well, I'm going to suggest again that the problem is principally on the American side. The Israelis need the Americans to be alongside them if they confront an adversary as powerful as Iran appears to be. But the Americans clearly are divided amongst themselves. The Pentagon, and I think we can say this with confidence, far from happy about being dragged into a confrontation, a military confrontation with Iran in the Middle East, as it's found that the conflict in Ukraine has drawn heavily on its resources, and as it worries about a potential conflict in China. The Pentagon also perhaps concerned about whether the United States might be drawn into another long conflict in the Middle East, which might have an uncertain and perhaps ultimately negative outcome. And in fact, the article, the Financial Times article, actually speaks about this. It says that Washington has warned Israel against overplaying its hand, insisting there should be a path back to a truce. There's an acknowledgement that Israel has made what Washington sees as tactical gains against Hezbollah in Lebanon after it killed Nasrallah and damaged much of Hezbollah's capacity to strike at Israel. But the gains are purely tactical, they are not strategic, and Well, we now have a quote from Jake Sullivan, no less. This is all from the Financial Times. The challenge going forward is to turn tactical wins in battle into a strategy that secures Israel's people and its future, Sullivan said at an event at the Israeli embassy in Washington this week, which frankly, again, I find a piece of supposed insight, which is, when you think about it, nothing more than a commonplace cliche. Just to say. Anyway, there we go. That's where we are. Uncertainty in Washington. Pentagon perhaps worried. The vice president also worried. She's presumably concerned about the impact, the potential impact of all of this on the election. And we've had a massive article in the Daily Telegraph in London, which perhaps provides some explanation for the worry, because this is the single most comprehensive and detailed article that I have seen anywhere on the effect of the Iranian missile strike of 1st October. And it confirms briefly the suspicion I've had that the strike was much more effective than the reports from Israel and Washington have up to now suggested. And the article is by Jotam Confino in Tel Aviv. It's published yesterday, 9th October, and its title reads, Iran has proved it can breach the world's greatest air defense system. What comes next could be devastating. The world is taking note. The world? Which part of the world? The United States? The Pentagon? Unquestionably. The world is taking note after Israel's formidable Iron Dome was breached by Iranian rockets. And the article is behind a paywall. It's very long, and I'm not going to read it all. But it says that the world watched helplessly as a missile barrage from Iran came raining down over Israel with less than 15 minutes warning. Experts are frantically working to understand how and if, notice the word if, Israel can defend itself from more waves of rockets if war continues to escalate in the Middle East. Video filmed by a passenger on a commercial jet from Dubai captured the start of the attack, which appears to have come from near the Iranian city of Shiraz. Shortly after Israelis were instructed to run for shelter, ballistic missiles are estimated to take about 12 minutes to reach their destination, first entering the Earth's atmosphere and later re-entering at speed. And then we're told that videos from Jordan show the missiles streaking across the sky towards Israel, while footage from sources on the ground in Israel shows air defense systems activating and in some cases being overwhelmed. One video showed at least 9 missiles making impacts near military facilities in Israel, whilst detailed accounts later found many more had broken through. And then we have a quote from Yehoshua Kaliski, senior researcher at INSS, a think tank in Tel Aviv, and he said that Iran's intention was to saturate the Israeli air defense system. And then there's a detailed description of that system and how it works. And then we're told that experts said the video suggests Israel may not have enough air defense units or interceptors to catch such a heavy barrage. Some observers also voiced concerns about the speed of the missiles. Fabian Hoffman, a missile expert and doctoral research fellow at the Oslo Nuclear Project, said that footage clearly shows the extraordinary speed in real time, some 600 to 700 meters per second. They are incredibly fast. All of the missiles Iran fired were hypersonic in essence until they re-enter the atmosphere and are slowed down, he said. And then we're told that we should not compare these Iranian missiles, these hypersonic Iranian missiles, with the much less effective missiles that Hezbollah launches. And then we're told that Israeli officials initially downplayed the damage caused by the attack, but later admitted that several military bases were hit, although no aircraft or critical infrastructure was damaged. And then we're told that a satellite image, the company Planet Labs later revealed, showed that the Nevatim airbase had been impacted in 30 different places, damaging hangars and buildings. And of course, as I've said in previous programs, we don't know what was inside those hangars, if anything was, and whether the damage to the hangars translated to damage to whatever was inside them. And then we're also told that a large clay crater from a missile was also found near the Israeli intelligence headquarters of Mossad in Glilot, north of Tel Aviv. In fact, there's been significant blast damage to the building as well. And we're told that in total it is estimated that more than 24 missiles, 24 plus, broke through air defenses. Some 20 missiles struck the Nevatim air base, while 3 missiles hit the Tel Nof base in central Israel. And then we're also told that from Dr. Kalinsky that it appeared that the Arrow system, that's part of Israel's air defense system, hit the engines on some of the missiles, but they continued to fly and eventually fell on the ground. And debris from the missiles was indeed found both at the West Bank and inside Israel following the attack. And we're also told that the air defense system might have difficulties dealing with certain types of drones. And then we are told that security experts have warned for years that a major coordinated missile attack by Iran and its proxies could have overwhelmed the air defense system and caused huge damage to civilian areas. After last Tuesday's attack, the evidence suggests a full-scale Iranian ballistic missile barrage hitting a densely populated area could kill hundreds of people. Of course, we don't know that the Iranians would target civilians in that kind of way. But of course, if they can break through and do that kind of damage against civilian areas, maybe they can do similar damage against military facilities as well. Now, all of this, to stress again, comes from the Daily Telegraph, strongly pro-Israeli newspaper. By the way, it's fascinating to read the thread to this article. A lot of the commentators there are in either shock or denial, just saying. But anyway, this article is in the Daily Telegraph, strongly pro-Israeli newspaper, one connected, or at least widely believed to be connected, to the British defence and security establishment. And they are telling us that this missile strike by Iran was effective and a significant wake-up call. Now, going back to what I was saying in previous programs, given this article in the Daily Telegraph, which I'm going to treat as authoritative, I can't help but think that if we are seeing delays, if there's hesitation about further missile strikes or further airstrikes on Iran, what is causing people in Washington and maybe Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to take pause is that they were taken by surprise by the scale and effectiveness of this strike. and they're wondering whether perhaps if Israel were to find itself in an all-out confrontation with Iran, one in which the United States was involved, whether the war, the battle, would be quite as straightforward as had been previously supposed. The Americans, the Pentagon also, looking at all of this, and they will have all of the information, aware about the general shortage of air defense systems. Brian Beletti has discussed this in many programs, that there's a general shortage of air defense systems across the West. Production of these systems is low. The war in Ukraine has been a massive drain. Well, the Pentagon, looking at all of this, perhaps uncertain how many of these missiles Iran possesses, well, they must be, it's understandable if, after revelations like this, they're taking a step back and saying, hold on, do we really know? Do we fully understand what we're up against? Now, I'm going to just add quickly a few points of my own, which is that this article does beg a certain number of questions. Iran is an industrialized society. It has a significant industrial base. It has some very, very capable engineers and scientists and a large number of facilities that, support Iran's military-industrial complex. But does it really have the capability to develop and build large numbers of hypersonic missiles, which is what we are told these missiles, 180 of them, were? Hypersonic missile technology is challenging. I don't think anybody would dispute this. The United States has been having difficulties with it. This technology is challenging. It requires complex materials. It requires advanced rocket fuels. Is Iran's chemical and metallurgical industries sufficiently advanced to produce materials of this kind? And if not, and I don't know one way or the other, but my guess might be that it is not, where did the Iranians get this information, this know-how? Well, it seems to me there is only one obvious source, and that must be Russia. And if the Russians are providing the Iranians with technology and assistance to build up a hypersonic missile program, then that suggests that the military relationship between Iran and Russia is much deeper than anybody had expected up to this time, and that it's probably been an ongoing relationship that has existed for some time, possibly going back to the middle years of the Trump administration. Just saying. So that's the first thing to say. Also, again, this article doesn't answer the question of how did the Iranians achieve that degree of precision in the attacks that they launched. Do they have the necessary data and targeting facilities to conduct an attack like this? And if they don't, then again, it seems to me that there is only one party which could have provided it, and that is the Russians. Now, if the Russians are as deeply involved in Iranian hypersonic missile developments, they presumably have some say over how these missiles are used And it probably explains why the Russians have the necessary leverage over the Iranians to get the Iranians to supply them with missiles, hypersonic missiles, if that is what has actually happened, which is what the US government says. So anyway, these are just thoughts. I'm not sure whether this is true. A number of people have said that I'm underestimating Iran's capabilities. I accept that. I don't know much about the extent of those capabilities. Maybe they are more advanced than I know. But I will say this. I do find it difficult to believe myself that Iran could have advanced to this level of hypersonic missile technology where the United States itself has struggled. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's one uncertainty. That's one issue that remains unresolved. The Israeli strike on Iran is going to come. But perhaps, given this unsettling information from this Iranian strike, perhaps it's not so difficult to understand why we're now looking at a delay and why these signs of disarray are there. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say today about the situation in the Middle East. Let's turn to the other great conflict, the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to suggest that the disarray here is at least equally great. Yesterday, at the end of my program, I mentioned how President Biden had announced that he was not going to confirm that he was not going to attend the summit in Ramstein on the 12th of October, where President Zelensky was going to present again his victory plan, which called for deep missile strikes against Russia and immediate admission or accelerated admission into NATO. President Biden wasn't going. Secretary Blinken, it turned out, wasn't going either. Biden said he wasn't going because he has to deal with the storms in the United States. But why would that prevent Blinken and perhaps Lloyd Austin from going in the president's place? Just saying. Anyway, the Americans clearly didn't want to go. As I've said in my previous program, they obviously don't want to be put in a position where they again have to answer questions about Zelensky's victory plan. They don't clearly like the victory plan. They don't want to authorize the deep strikes into Russia. They certainly don't want accelerated membership for Ukraine in NATO. They don't want to appear at the same time to be flatly rejecting those things. When Keir Starmer went to Washington a few weeks ago to press the Americans to agree to missile strikes against Russia, the Americans told him that they weren't going to change their policy for the moment, but this was all going to be discussed at Ramstein on the 12th of October. And when Zelensky came to Washington to discuss his victory plan, his plan for deep missile strikes and for accelerated entry into NATO, the Americans told him exactly the same thing. Wait until the 12th of October. Wait until Ramstein. And Ramstein has now come, or the date for Ramstein is now come, and the Americans have said, no, we're not going after all. And the Europeans, the other parties that would have attended the Ramstein meeting, without the Americans, they're unable to make a decision, and the entire Ramstein meeting has been called off. And so far, there is no news that I'm aware of a replacement date. And there's some speculation that the next meeting will only take place after the election and perhaps after the new president is inaugurated. So we see that there are delays, that the Americans are delaying, and incidentally, the Pentagon, I understand, has issued a further statement. I haven't read the statement myself. I'm getting this purely from third parties, from third-party sources, but apparently the Pentagon has again reiterated that the United States has not changed its policy about deep strikes, deep missile strikes against Russia. The American prohibition on such strikes remains in place. So the Americans essentially avoiding discussion of Zelensky's victory plan. Now, Zelensky himself has also had to face another blow. He was trying to get a peace summit, a follow-up peace summit organized in November. He was telling everybody that the Russians this time would be invited to attend, though the Russians had made it very clear that they would not attend, because the only purpose of the November summit, apparently, was to discuss Zelensky's peace plan, which is, of course, not a peace plan, but a plan for Russia's unconditional capitulation, with the Russians agreeing to withdraw all their troops from pre-2014 Ukraine, including Crimea. So the Russians had made it clear that they were not going to attend. So far, no country has agreed to host this peace conference in November. Zelensky has approached Switzerland, India, and Saudi Arabia, and all three apparently have said no. So the peace conference has therefore had to be cancelled. So Zelensky, as of now, is without a Ramstein meeting at which he can present his victory plan. He is without a peace conference, and the Americans give every sign of wanting to avoid him. So what has he been doing? Well, he is on a huge European tour. He's been going from one European country to another. Apparently he's intending to end up in Britain, the one place where I suspect he believes that he will have a warm reception. He probably will. It's not at all clear what ideas he is taking with him. The Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera says that his latest proposal is that, yes, there should be a conflict freeze. Also, he accepts that NATO membership, immediate NATO membership or accelerated NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the table. But in the absence of that, well, what about accelerated or immediate membership of the European Union instead? This presumably being the second best option. Alas, for Zelensky, I suspect that the Europeans are going to be as unhappy and uneasy about that proposal as the Americans were about Zelensky's proposal for accelerated entry by Ukraine into NATO. Because as article after article has pointed out, Ian Proud, by the way, the former British diplomat who has an excellent Substack blog, has already discussed this at great length. For the European point of view, early entry of Ukraine into the EU would be calamitous. Ukraine's financial demands on the EU, particularly for support of the agricultural part of its economy, would be crippling. There's all kinds of governance issues in Ukraine which show no sign of being resolved. In fact, they appear to be getting worse. There's also the major issue, I suspect, for some countries of allowing unrestricted movement of Ukrainians into the territory of the Union. Anyway, various EU officials and member states, including, by the way, Poland, have already been going out of their way to pour cold water on that idea. And I don't expect that stance to change anytime soon. I cannot imagine that Germany, for example, would agree to this. I am sure that there would be strong opposition in Germany. And of course, in France, the opposition would be overwhelming. The parties, the Rassemblement National and the Left Alliance that won the most votes in the recent parliamentary elections, between them around 20%, 60% of the vote, well, they would be bound to oppose such a proposal. And I can't imagine that President Macron would be in a position to face that kind of opposition down. So, Zelensky touring Europe, coming with that particular proposal, but it is as likely to be snubbed as his other proposal for accelerated entry into NATO is. The Europeans, however, are in a very, very difficult position. They've gone out of their way to support Ukraine. The EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has invested a huge amount of her and the EU's political and economic capital in the success of the Ukraine project. So have the governments of some member states, most importantly, the government of Germany. They're going to find it very, very difficult to say to Zelensky a simple no. So more likely than not, what they're all going to be telling Zelensky is that, yes, we agree, obviously your place is indeed in the EU. We're going to do everything we can to make your entry into the EU as quick and as smooth as possible. We're going to try and simplify the systems. We're going to set up working parties and other parties to think about how this can be done as rapidly as we can. And we're going to do everything we can to supply you with more weapons. We're going to try to step up our own production, buy our weapons from all sorts of places. So they're not going to say to him a straightforward no. They're going to string him along, and along the way, they're going to string Ukraine also along. They're going to give the Ukrainians the hope that this will happen, even though in reality, and in fact, it won't. So just saying, this is where we are at the moment. Zelensky, with his begging bowl, because that's basically what it is, touring the European capitals. The Americans have snubbed him. He's hoping, desperately hoping, that he's going to get something from the Europeans instead. And the reality is that without the Americans, nobody in Europe can really step in and take the Americans' place. Everyone knows that, but no one, of course, has the courage to say it straightforwardly. I say no one. Of course, one person has had that courage. That's Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary. He got scolded in a, frankly, I thought, completely out of control speech in the European Parliament by EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The bile in her speech directed at Orban really was something to see. Orban is saying it. Some people like Robert Fico in Slovakia are saying it. He's even talking, by the way, about going to Moscow, just to say. But the major European countries, for the moment, they are unable to say it. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and of course, those outside the EU, Britain, they're all going to go on pretending that they're fully behind Ukraine, even though in practice, without the Americans, they're nowhere. And Well, we're also getting another story. So Corriere della Sera tells us that Zelensky is telling everybody that yes, he is up for a freeze of the conflict, allowing the Russians to occupy territories in the east, but he wants accelerated EU entry in return for that. But El Mundo, another newspaper, perhaps not quite as authoritative as Corriere della Sera. Anyway, they're telling us something completely different. They're saying that, and this appears to be sourced from European officials, they are saying that Zelensky is proving as intransigent as ever, that he's not prepared to compromise on anything, that he continues to insist on his original peace formula being implemented, and that what he's going around all of these European capitals is telling the European leaders that he's not prepared to agree to continued Russian occupation of even so much as a millimeter of Ukrainian territory. He does want missile strikes against Russia. He does want accelerated EU entry, but he's not prepared to concede to the Russians anything. He wants his peace plan implemented in full now, and what he wants is the EU's help, the Europeans' help, to try to get overwhelming diplomatic pressure exerted on the Russians so that even as the Russians win the war, or look like they're winning the war, they will suddenly cave and capitulate and agree to his demands. A fantastic idea. Perhaps, however, one that actually more accurately reflects Zelensky's true position than the Corriere della Sera story. It is, after all, more consistent with what Zelensky is saying publicly. No one in Europe, apparently, however, not even Orban, has the courage so far to say, well, Ukraine is losing the war. Without the Americans, the war definitely is lost. So what we need to do is to start discussions with the Russians based on Putin's 14th June 2024 proposals. In other words, Istanbul Plus. No one is prepared to say that. Zelensky is not prepared to say that. And no one apparently is prepared to tell Zelensky, well, if you really do want negotiations, if you really do want a diplomatic outcome, you must be prepared to negotiate and talk to the Russians. And that means scrapping your decree, which prohibits you from doing that. And that you need to get on and do that now and fast. Nobody is prepared to tell Zelensky that. And Zelensky isn't prepared to tell himself that. And no one else in Ukraine is prepared to tell Zelensky to do that either. So we remain caught in this trap. The Russians are winning the war. Ukraine is going down. The Americans are now showing conclusive signs of walking away. The United States can walk away from this conflict. It will suffer severe damage to its global credibility, but in terms of its security interests, the effect will be minimal. So the Americans can walk away. They are less affected by the economic consequences of this war than Europe is. So they can walk away, worry about other things, the Middle East, China, whatever. The Europeans left hanging out to dry. The Ukrainians, the same. They can wring their hands and in despair. There's not ultimately very much they can do except begin those negotiations, talk to the Russians, but they continue to rule out doing that very thing. Now, the Russians must be watching all of this, and they must be saying to themselves that the Americans are indeed finally starting to edge away from the conflict in Ukraine. They've taken it as far as they can. Going further would put American interests and security at risk. So the Americans are now walking away. As I said, they will keep their power intact. This will not have catastrophic consequences for them. So the Russians can see the Americans walking away, and they can see the Europeans in disarray, and they can see the Ukrainians stuck where they are. What incentive, therefore, do the Russians have to stop? I cannot see any. I'm not getting any sense that the Russians feel that there are any. All the indications are that the Russians intend to press on. If Zelensky changes his stance and indicates to the Russians that he is prepared to negotiate on the basis of Istanbul Plus, then the Russians will sit down to talk to him. But they will not, I think, agree a ceasefire until the Ukrainian troops leave the four regions, and the Ukrainians know that if they leave they pull their troops back from the four regions, they will never go back, and they will also have a large number of very angry, heavily armed men who fought to retain for Ukraine the four regions on their hands, even as Ukraine continues to negotiate the terms of its capitulation with Russia. It's not really that difficult to understand why Zelensky doesn't want to be put in this position. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are at the moment. The big take from all of this is that the Americans now, finally, are starting to take the first clear steps to tiptoe away. Let's turn to the situation on the battlefronts. Now, yesterday, reports were starting to circulate in the media, both in social media, both in Russia and Ukraine, that the Ukrainian military leadership has gradually come round to the view that Selidovo and Kurakhovo are undefendable, and that the Ukrainian troops who are located there must be withdrawn, and that these two towns must be abandoned to the Russians. In the case of Selidovo, the probable explanation for this is reports that the Russian grouping located in Tsukurinye, the part of it that has been advancing northwards towards Selidovo, is outflanking Selidovo from the south and is approaching the village of Vishnieve, which is located to the west of Selidovo. If the Russians capture this village, all access to Selidovo from any road will be closed. The Russians are already located east of Selidovo in Mikhailivka, north of Selidovo after they advanced from Marinivka beyond the M04 highway. They are located south of Selidovo in Tsukurinye. They control the railways that lead into Selidovo, and if they capture Vishnieve, the last remaining road and rail links into Selidovo from the west will have been closed off as well. So it looks as if the Ukrainians maybe, just maybe, finally accepting that Selidovo is lost and that they're preparing to pull back from Selidovo. And there are reports that the Ukrainians are also preparing to pull back from Kurakhovo as well. And well, here I've discussed the very grave crisis that the Ukrainians face, the fact that there is a grouping of Ukrainian soldiers, several thousand men, apparently now effectively encircled in the villages of Oleksandropil, Vovchenka, Kurakhovo, the small town of Girnik and Izmailivka. And there's more reports, by the way, of the Russians tightening the circle around this cauldron. And, well, there's also reports this morning that the village of Maximilianovka, immediately to the west of Kurakhovo, is also now about to fall completely under Russian control. The Russians are already located in the village of Ostrivske, to the northwest of Kurakhovo. The Russians are starting to push northwards from Ugleda. Even the Ukrainian command can finally see that there is a real danger of encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo, just as there already is in those small villages to the northwest of Kurakhovo, and that the time has come to retreat from all of these places. And, well, there are reports, therefore, we don't yet know whether they're true, but there are reports that the Ukrainians are now finally contemplating a large-scale withdrawal from these two towns. The objective being what ought to have been the objective, in my opinion, from the outset, which is to fortify Pokrovsk and to make the big stand there. And the trouble is that because so much time and energy has been spent or wasted defending places like Selidovo, Ukrainsk, Girnik, Novgorodivka, Grodivka, all of these places, apparently the defenses in Pokrovsk are in a very fragile condition, and that with the fall of Ugleda, the Russians are able to conduct an offensive to outflank Pokrovsk from the southwest. That might be what a battle for Velika Novosilka will lead to once that battle begins. This is the small village or small town to the west of Ugleda, which the Russians are now just a few kilometers from. And perhaps a clue of the direction of thinking that the Russians are taking is that they've just released some very dramatic videos of the destruction of another Patriot missile launcher, and even more importantly, a number of the radars associated with the Patriot missile system in Dnipro region, which of course lies directly west of Pokrovsk. This is a further example of the Ukrainians attempting to position Patriot missile systems in the open fields close to the contact line, the Russians detecting the Patriot missiles there and carrying out their destruction through Iskander missile strikes. So anyway, that's the situation at the moment in the key Pokrovsk, Ugleda, Kurakhovo, Selidovo battlefield. It could be that we are close to a decisive moment when Ukrainian resistance south of Pokrovsk crumbles, and that the battle for Pokrovsk itself then begins on terms which, to be clear, will be very, very disadvantageous to the Ukrainians as well. Now, there's a lot more information pouring in from Toretsk. It does seem as if the Russians have not only captured the central area of Toretsk, there's still mopping up operations, as they say, being carried out, but they've also captured the area of the high-rise buildings in Toretsk and the suburb of Zabalka. The last battle that's going to be fought in Toretsk appears to be for this coal mine and slag heap located at the western end of Toretsk. It seems that the Russians are already located in this on the territory of this coal mine, and it looks as if the Russians have also, to some extent at least, bypassed this coal mine from the west, which means that the Ukrainian troops defending themselves in the coal mine risk encirclement. But anyway, there is a battle going on, but I don't think anybody any longer seriously doubts the outcome there. And I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think the battle for Toretsk is now in its last days. I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold their positions there for very much longer. And at some point within the next few days, weeks maybe, the Ukrainians are going to withdraw completely from Toretsk, which will then fall entirely under Russian control. And lastly, we've had more news, more confirmed news of further Russian advances in the Kursk area. The Russians have recaptured some more villages in the Kursk area. But there is some supposed uncertainty about the situation around Seversk. Over the last couple of days, the Russian Defense Ministry has said that the village of Verkhokamyanska, immediately to the west of Seversk, has been captured by the Russians. There are reports from Russian sources that the village of Grigorovka, to the northeast of Seversk, is also in the process of being captured by the Russians. There's reports that the Russians are advancing into the village of Serebyanka and that they're capturing forest areas from the north, pushing south from the town of Kremenaya. All of this seemed to be the position until yesterday, until Riba, famous Russian war blogger, came forward and said that it's all lies and untrue, that the Russian generals in command in this area are making it all up, that the Russians haven't even captured Belogorovka, and none of these places that they're supposed to have captured have indeed been captured, that the Ukrainians are successfully resisting in all of these places, and that this is all lies and falsehoods, and we should pay no attention to them. Now, I think that the first thing to say is that I don't know one way or the other because I am not there. That's the first thing to say. The second thing I'm going to say is that people do tell lies. It's not impossible that the general in charge in this area is telling lies to the Russian Defense Ministry, which is reproducing them. To my knowledge, the general is a man called Gennady Anashkin. I'm not absolutely certain of that, by the way, but maybe he is making things up. As I said, such things do take place. But I have to say that I think the weight of evidence is against it. First of all, our old friend, Andrei Marochko, is back, and he's giving us further news about these battles, which seems to correspond exactly with what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us. He says that in their liberation operations, Russian army units have intensified fire on Ukrainian militants' position in the settlement of Serebyanka. They've also managed to narrow the interposition space northeast of Grigorovka. The distance between the basic forces is less than 2 kilometers. Now, of course, It may be that he's being fooled as well, that all this is also reproducing lies. But he's a fairly well-connected person in this general area. And I would have thought that his own sources, which are probably independent to some extent from the Russian defense ministries, would be telling him the truth, and that he wouldn't be reproducing these stories in this way if they weren't true. I also have to say that Riba, back in 2022, in the first weeks of the special military operation, impressed me then as one of the most interesting and informative of Russian bloggers. But I have to say this, I think his reliability has lessened over time. And I think that, like a number of other bloggers, he was too quick to accept many of the stories that Prigozhin spread about the Russian military leadership, and that this has affected his understanding of what's going on the battlefronts ever since. Riba has consistently published all sorts of alarmist information over the last year or so. I remember him doing this particularly about Krinky, for example, the Ukrainian operation in Krinky. And I have to say that much of this has turned out in the end to be unsubstantiated and untrue. But let me repeat again, I'm not there. I don't know this for a fact. Maybe he is telling the truth. I rather doubt it, but events will tell us one way or the other. In the long term, it doesn't make any difference. The battle for Donbass has not been won around Seversk. It's been won in other places, in Pokrovsk, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about what is going on in those places. Ukraine's position remains critical, as I've discussed in many programs, and it's just become much worse as the Americans give the first clear sign that they're tiptoeing out. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.